The drone of the refrigeration units was the first thing Sergeant Marco Ricci noticed as the American transport trucks approached the camp. It was an unfamiliar mechanical hum, steady and persistent, cutting through the dry Arizona air with a sound that seemed impossibly modern. He stood with the other Italian prisoners, their uniforms still stained with the dust of North Africa, watching as the convoy rolled through the gates of Camp Florence. The men around him shifted nervously, whispering among themselves about what fresh humiliation might await them. They had been captured in Tunisia, marched onto ships, and transported across an ocean to this strange, vast country. None of them knew what to expect, but all of them remembered the warnings from their officers. Americans were savage, wasteful, and would treat prisoners with terrible cruelty. The trucks pulled to a stop, and the drivers jumped down from their cabs, casual and unhurried. Marco tensed, expecting shouts, perhaps even blows. Instead, the Americans barely glanced at the prisoners as they moved to the rear of the vehicles and threw open the heavy doors. Cold air billowed out in visible clouds despite the desert heat, carrying with it an impossible smell. Fresh fruit, vegetables, meat, scents that belonged to peacetime markets, not prisoner of war camps in the middle of war. "Impossibile," whispered Private Antonio Bianchi beside him. "How can this be?" Inside the trucks, stacked in neat rows and packed in ice, were crates of fresh produce. Tomatoes still red and firm, lettuce crisp and green, oranges bright as tiny suns. Beef hung from hooks, glistening and unmarked by the rot that had become so familiar in their rations back in North Africa. "Impossibile," whispered Private Antonio Bianchi beside him. "How can this be?" Milk in glass bottles, cheese wrapped in paper, even eggs, dozens of them, perfect and unbroken, all transported across miles of desert in trucks that somehow kept everything as fresh as if it had been harvested that morning. Marco felt his mouth go dry. He had not seen food like this since before the war began. In Italy, even before their capture, soldiers had subsisted on whatever could be preserved for months. Hard bread, dried beans, occasional meat so salted it barely resembled its source. Yet here, in captivity, the Americans were unloading food that officers in Rome would have envied. What kind of enemy offered such bounty to prisoners of war? And if this was how they treated their captives, what might it say about the conflict they had been fighting? As the American soldiers began carrying crates toward the mess hall, Marco couldn't help but wonder, had everything they'd been told about this war been as preserved and artificial as the rations they'd survived on until now? The prisoners were herded into formation later that day, the sun beating down on their backs as they stood at attention. Captain Lorenzo Ferrara, formerly of the Italian 10th Army, stood at the head of the assembled men, his uniform pressed despite weeks of travel. He had been one of their most confident leaders in North Africa, assuring his company that American soldiers were undisciplined and weak, that their industrial might was propaganda, their resolve easily broken. Now his eyes darted nervously as the camp commandant approached. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," the American officer announced through an interpreter. 3 meals daily, medical care, work details for which you will receive payment in camp scrip. Any attempt to escape will be punished, but no man will be harmed if he follows the rules. A murmur passed through the ranks. Payment? For prisoners? Captain Ferrara's jaw tightened visibly. This had to be some elaborate deception, a psychological ploy to lower their guard before the true cruelty began. Many of the men nodded to each other, certain that the abundance they had glimpsed in those refrigerated trucks was merely for show. That certainty lasted precisely until their first meal in Camp Florence. The mess hall was simple but immaculately clean, with long tables set with real plates and metal utensils, not the wooden bowls and fingers they had often used on the front. Steam rose from trays of pasta with actual sauce, bread that yielded to pressure rather than requiring soaking in water, and portions that seemed obscenely generous for men accustomed to measuring rations by the spoonful. "Manja, eat," encouraged the mess hall workers, Americans who seemed genuinely concerned that the Italians were hesitating before the food. Private Bianchi was the first to break rank, driven by hunger that overwhelmed caution. He took a bite of bread and his eyes widened. "È fresco," he announced, amazed. "It's fresh." Soon they were all eating, some with restraint born of suspicion, others with the desperate intensity of men who had known true hunger. Marco watched as soldiers who had marched across Libya on crusts and water now filled themselves with more calories in one sitting than they had seen in weeks. An elderly corporal beside him wept silently into his soup, overwhelmed by flavors he thought he might never taste again. "This cannot last," Captain Ferrara insisted quietly to his officers as they gathered in a corner. "It's for show, for the Red Cross perhaps. Tomorrow it will be gruel and beatings." But tomorrow brought another meal just as substantial, and the next day another. The refrigerated trucks arrived every morning at dawn, their engines humming that strange mechanical song, bringing fresh supplies not just to the officers' mess as might be expected, but to every prisoner in the compound. How many farms, factories, and workers were required to maintain such a supply chain? And what did it reveal about the nation they had been sent to fight? By the end of the first week, the prisoners had begun to notice other details that shattered their expectations. The guards wore clean uniforms daily and carried themselves with casual confidence rather than the rigid formality or compensatory cruelty they had expected. When one young private collapsed from the heat during assembly, the American medics rushed to help him with equipment and medicines that had been scarce even in Italian military hospitals. Most surprisingly, when work details were assigned, the promised payment materialized. Coupons that could be exchanged at the camp canteen for cigarettes, additional food, even small luxuries like writing paper and soap. Something fundamental was shifting in the way the men viewed their captors. The refrigerated trucks that arrived with mechanical precision each dawn had begun to represent more than just food. They symbolized a system, an organization, a country with resources so vast it could treat its prisoners better than Italy had been able to treat its own fighting men. For Captain Ferrara and others who had staked their identity on Italy's righteous cause, this realization was more threatening than any weapon. What if the enemy was not the barbaric, chaotic power they had been taught to expect? What could that mean for everything else they had been told? As Marco lay in his bunk that night, listening to the whir of electric fans cooling the barracks, another luxury unimaginable on the front, he found himself facing an unsettling question. If America could refrigerate trucks to bring fresh oranges to enemy prisoners in the desert, what chance had Italy ever had against such a nation? The pattern of abundance continued as weeks turned into months. I prigionieri bicannono a notare dettagli che rivelavano la scala di americana produzione con ogni passante giorno. Sergeant Marco Ricci aveva avuto assegnato un lavoro dettaglio nella Camp Kitchen, dove aiutava a sbarcare quei refrigerati trucks che avevano prima scioccato all'arrivo. Working al lato l'americano Quartermaster Corp, l'Erniche Camp Florence era just one of dozens di prisoner facilities across the country, each ricevendo similari deliveries. These shipments, explained Corporal Jenkins, the supply officer che spoke broken Italian, come from central depots in Phoenix, some items from much farther, California, Idaho, even Chicago. Marco struggava a graspare le logistiche. In Italy, muovere food anche 20 km durante guerra aveva diventato nearly impossible due to fuel shortages and bombed railways. Here, the Americans casually mentioned shipping fresh meat thousands of kilometers across their continent, kept cold the entire journey through some network of refrigerated warehouses, trains, and finally, these miraculous trucks. One morning, as he helped unload a particularly large shipment, Marco noticed something that stopped him mid-motion. The crate of oranges he was carrying had a stamp, Grade B, Civilian Market Rejected. These fruits, perfectly round and unblemished in his eyes, had been deemed insufficient for American households. What were their Grade A oranges like, he wondered, if these were considered substandard? Private Domenico Rossi, who worked in the camp laundry, reported similar discoveries. They changed the sheets every week, he told the others during their evening meal. Clean white cotton, not the burlap we had in barracks back home. And they throw away uniforms with small tears instead of mending them. The medical supplies are the same, added Medic Sergeant Paolo Conti, who assisted in the camp infirmary. I saw them discard half-used bottles of iodine, perfectly good bandages because a package had been opened but not fully used. In our field hospitals, we washed and reused everything until it fell apart. These observations weren't just about physical goods, they revealed something profound about the society that produced them. Italy had entered the war believing in its cultural superiority, its historic greatness, its right to empire. Yet here was evidence of a different kind of power, the capacity to produce so much that waste itself became unremarkable. Captain Ferrara tried to maintain morale among the officers, insisting that American abundance was merely material, lacking the spiritual strength and historical glory of Italy. But his words rang increasingly hollow when confronted with the daily reality of life in Camp Florence. The guards worked 8-hour shifts with regular days off, rotated duties to prevent fatigue, and received the same quality food as they served to prisoners. They moved with the ease of men who knew their nation could replace anything they needed: weapons, vehicles, even the endless reams of paperwork that documented every aspect of camp life. The Italian prisoners had been raised on stories of their ancient civilization, of Rome's glory, of Mediterranean cultural supremacy over the young, brash Americans. Now they found themselves questioning those certainties as they witnessed systematic efficiency on a scale that made their own military preparations seem almost childlike in comparison. During a rare rainfall, Marco watched as American supply sergeants distributed fresh uniforms to guards who had gotten wet, casually replacing wool jackets and boots that would have been precious commodities in the Italian army. When he mentioned this to Antonio Bianchi, the young private shook his head in amazement. "My brother wrote to me before Tunisia," Bianchi confided. "He said soldiers at home were being issued cardboard shoe soles because leather had run out. Cardboard, while these Americans change boots because of a little rain." This was the texture of their growing realization, not just abundance, but the systems behind it. The cold chain that kept food fresh from farm to mess hall. The seemingly limitless supply of fuel that powered those refrigerated trucks day after day. The industrial capacity that produced so many uniforms that rain damage warranted immediate replacement rather than careful drying and repair. Marco found himself wondering what else they had been wrong about. If the Americans could accomplish this in the desert, creating an oasis of abundance for enemy prisoners, what might their actual war effort look like? What factories, shipyards, and arsenals might be producing the machines of war with the same relentless efficiency that delivered fresh eggs to captives every morning? That night, as the mechanical hum of the camp's generators provided another reminder of America's energy resources, Marco lay awake listening to whispered conversations among his fellow prisoners. Their tone had shifted subtly from resentment to something more complex, a grudging admiration mixed with dawning comprehension of how badly they had misjudged their adversary. And still, those refrigerated trucks would arrive again at dawn, their engines announcing another day of impossible plenty in the middle of global war. "I worked in my father's grocery before the war," Private Luca Moretti told the circle of men gathered in the barracks after dinner. "In our village, we had ice deliveries once a week, blocks wrapped in sawdust that melted by the third day. Only the wealthiest families had ice boxes." He gestured toward the mess hall where the day's leftovers were being stored in massive stainless steel refrigerators. "These Americans keep everything cold all the time, even here in the desert. How is this possible?" The men had begun sharing their civilian backgrounds, comparing what they knew of Italy with what they witnessed daily in Camp Florence. These conversations, tentative at first, had grown more open as the weeks passed, as the reality of their situation settled in their minds. They were prisoners, yes, but prisoners who ate better, slept better, and lived in cleaner conditions than they had as free soldiers in the Italian army. "It's the electricity," explained Corporal Vincenzo Romano, who had been an engineering student in Milan before the war. See how the lights stay on all night? In Italy, we had blackouts even before bombing began to save fuel. Here, they generate power constantly. The refrigerated trucks, the mess hall cold storage, the fans in our barracks, it all runs on an electrical grid more extensive than anything we had at home. Marco listened, remembering how his mother had cooked by candlelight in their apartment in Naples during the last days before he was deployed. Yet here, in captivity, banks of fluorescent lights illuminated the camp pathways from dusk till dawn, burning fuel for the comfort and security of enemy prisoners. Their farms must be different, too, added Sergeant Emilio Basso, who came from an agricultural family near Venice. The consistency of supply, tomatoes the same size, carrots all perfect. In my father's fields, we sorted vegetables by hand.
The best went to market. The irregular ones we kept for ourselves. Here, even the rejected produce is better than what most Italians see. Captain Ferrara, overhearing these conversations, tried to interject with reminders of Italian cultural heritage, of opera and art and ancient history. Americans have refrigerators, he said dismissively. We have the Colosseum and Da Vinci. But such comparisons found less traction as the prisoners' direct experience contradicted more of the propaganda they had absorbed. The Americans they interacted with daily weren't the uncultured barbarians they'd been led to expect. Many guards spoke multiple languages, read books during their breaks, and discussed their university plans after the war. One played classical piano at the officers' club, which the Italian prisoners could sometimes hear during still desert evenings. Most disturbing to their preconceptions was the casual equality they observed. Officers and enlisted men ate the same food, used the same facilities, received the same medical care. Even more shocking was the treatment of the few African American soldiers they saw working in support roles, formerly segregated but still armed, still wearing the same uniform, still visibly part of the same military machine. In Ethiopia, they told us Americans kept their Negroes in chains, whispered Corporal Romano. But look, that supply sergeant has authority over white drivers. Their captors seemed indifferent to these observations, neither boastful about their country's capacity nor particularly concerned with impressing the prisoners. The abundance was not performative. It was simply standard. When Marco asked Corporal Jenkins why prisoners received such good food, the American looked genuinely confused. "It's just the regular army supply system," he shrugged. "Everybody gets fed the same. That's the rule." The idea that such equality and abundance could be just the rule, rather than a special arrangement, was perhaps the most revolutionary concept the prisoners encountered. It suggested an entire society built on foundations different from the scarcity and hierarchy they had known. That evening, as the prisoners sat outside their barracks in the cooling desert air, a strange vehicle approached the administrative building, an ambulance, but not like any they had seen before. It was immaculately white, with a red cross painted on each side, and as it pulled to a stop, they could see it too had a refrigeration unit humming on its roof. "A refrigerated ambulance?" Marco asked one of the guards. "Blood transport," the guard explained casually. "Keeps plasma and whole blood cold for the field hospitals. They fly it in from collection centers on the coast." The men fell silent, absorbing this. In North Africa, their wounded had died for lack of blood, had been operated on without anesthesia when supplies ran out. Yet here was America, refrigerating not just food, but blood itself, transporting it across a continent to save lives. Private Bianchi crossed himself instinctively. Captain Ferrara looked away, his expression unreadable. Later that night, Marco heard quiet sobbing from the bunk above his, one of the younger soldiers struggling with the weight of these realizations. What was crumbling was not just their confidence in Italy's cause, but the very framework through which they understood the world. If they had been so wrong about America's capabilities, what else had they misunderstood? And what did it mean for the families and homeland they had left behind? The summer heat intensified as June turned to July, and with it came a shift in the prisoners' daily routines. The camp commandant, mindful of health concerns, adjusted work schedules to avoid the brutal midday sun. Morning details now began at dawn, with a long afternoon rest period before evening tasks resumed. During these hot, quiet hours, the Italians gathered in shaded areas, talking in low voices about home, about the war, and, increasingly, about the country that held them captive. "They say in Detroit, automobile factories now make tanks," said Private Bianchi, who had picked up bits of English and conversation from the guards. "One factory, Ford, produces a bomber plane every hour." "Impossible," scoffed Sergeant Trevini, though his denial lacked conviction. No factory could work at such speed. Marco remained silent, thinking of the refrigerated trucks that never failed to arrive each morning. If Americans could maintain such complex logistics for prisoner food, what might they accomplish when building weapons? The thought troubled him deeply, not for his own sake, but for Italy itself. What hope did his country have against such industrial might?
As if in answer to these unspoken questions, something unprecedented happened that afternoon. The camp commandant, Major Williams, assembled all prisoners in the mess hall. Against regulations, he had arranged a film screening, documentary footage showing American war production. Perhaps he sensed the Italians' curiosity, or perhaps he simply believed that understanding the full scope of Allied capabilities might discourage escape attempts. Whatever his motivation, the effect was profound. On a portable screen, the prisoners watched massive factories stretching for miles, assembly lines where thousands of workers built aircraft, tanks, and ships in quantities that seemed mathematically impossible. They saw harbors filled with vessels, trainloads of materials crossing vast landscapes, and warehouses stacked with supplies that dwarfed anything they had imagined. "La madre di Dio," whispered Captain Ferrara, his voice cracking. For the first time since their capture, he looked genuinely afraid. The statistics rolled across the screen. America was producing 70,000 aircraft that year, more than Italy had built in its entire aviation history. A single shipyard could launch a Liberty ship in 14 days. Tank production exceeded 50,000 annually. And perhaps most telling for the Italians, American food production was so enormous that despite feeding its own population and military, it could export millions of tons to allies while still maintaining the supply chain that brought fresh oranges to prisoners in the Arizona desert. When the lights came on, the prisoners sat in stunned silence. These were not actors or studio sets. The scale alone made falsification impossible. What they had witnessed was the mobilization of an entire continent, resources beyond imagination directed toward a single purpose: victory. "We were told," said Corporal Romano quietly, "that America was soft, divided, unwilling to fight, that democracy made them weak." Sergeant Conti, the medic, nodded slowly. "I treated men in Sicily who died because we lacked plasma. Here they refrigerate blood and fly it across a country." The mood in the camp shifted palpably after the film screening. The prisoners continued their work details, ate their meals, and followed routines, but something fundamental had changed in their perception. Daily activities that had once seemed like curiosities, the abundant hot water, the clean sheets, the fresh vegetables, now carried the weight of inescapable evidence. They were experiencing firsthand just a tiny fraction of American production capacity, directed not even toward war aims, but toward the humane treatment of enemies. For Captain Ferrara and other officers who had deeply invested in fascist ideology, this created a crisis of identity. Some retreated into stubborn denial, insisting the film was propaganda, the camp conditions a strategic deception. Others grew quiet and introspective, wrestling with uncomfortable truths in private. A few began cautiously questioning the decisions that had led Italy into war alongside Germany against such overwhelming odds. Could Mussolini not see this? Marco overheard one lieutenant asking another as they sorted laundry. Did our leaders not understand what we were facing? The question lingered unanswered, too dangerous to pursue openly, too important to dismiss entirely. Yet it was there in every refrigerated truck that arrived, in every generator that hummed through the night, in every fresh bandage applied to minor wounds that, in their own army, might have been left to fester due to shortages. For Marco, watching his fellow prisoners navigate this psychological terrain was almost as revealing as the American abundance itself.
Men who had been shaped by years of propaganda and military hierarchy were slowly, painfully reassessing core beliefs. Some found the process unbearable, clinging to resentment and suspicion as shields against doubt. Others embraced the evidence before them, already thinking beyond the war to what it might mean for Italy's future. And still, the refrigerated trucks arrived each dawn, their mechanical song a reminder that somewhere beyond the camp perimeter, a system of unprecedented scale continued to function regardless of their philosophical struggles. America's industrial heart beat on, producing food, medicine, weapons, and supplies in quantities that rendered individual disbelief irrelevant. The trucks did not care if the Italians accepted what they represented. They simply continued to appear with mathematical precision, delivering their daily lesson in logistics and power.
That evening, as the sun set behind distant mountains and cast long shadows across the camp, Marco found himself wondering, when the war finally ended, which vision would prevail in shaping the world that followed? The hierarchical nationalism they had left behind, or this systematic abundance they witnessed daily in captivity? "Do you think they eat like this in America?" Private Enzo Calabria asked, gesturing to his plate piled with roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh greens. "I mean, regular people, not just soldiers?" It was a question that had begun to circulate among the prisoners, part of their growing curiosity about the society that could produce such material wealth. The refrigerated trucks, the electrical systems, the mechanization they glimpsed through the camp fence, were these common throughout America or exceptional war measures? Lieutenant Rizzo, who had studied briefly at Columbia University before the war, became an unofficial authority on such questions. "From what I saw in New York," he explained to the gathered men, "ordinary workers lived better than middle-class Italians. Apartments with electric refrigerators, automobiles for commuting, restaurants affordable to factory employees." This image of a nation where material comfort extended beyond elites to common citizens was perhaps more revolutionary than any political ideology. It suggested a different relationship between people and state, between labor and reward. "My cousin emigrated to Chicago in '36, offered Corporal Martino. His letters home described food so plentiful that restaurants served portions too large to finish. We thought he was exaggerating to justify leaving Italy." Sergeant Marco Ricci listened to these conversations with growing understanding. The refrigerated trucks that had first astonished him now seemed emblematic of something larger. Not just American wealth, but a system designed to distribute that wealth more broadly than the hierarchical structures he had known in Italy. The guards, who casually mentioned their families' cars and radios, their plans for college after the war, these weren't the sons of aristocrats, but ordinary men from farms and small towns. Captain Ferrara still attempted to maintain ideological discipline, reminding his officers that material wealth wasn't everything, that Italy's cultural heritage and spiritual values transcended American commercialism. But his arguments found diminishing resonance. The prisoners had moved beyond abstract comparisons to direct experience. They were living inside American systems, experiencing firsthand how they functioned. Work details outside the camp perimeter provided further evidence. Prisoners assigned to agricultural labor witnessed vast irrigated fields stretching to the horizon, harvested by machines that did the work of 100 men. Those who helped at nearby warehouses saw supply management techniques that tracked every item with ruthless efficiency. Even the camp administration demonstrated organizational methods that processed paperwork, supplies, and personnel movements with minimal waste or confusion. For men raised in a society where personal connections and hierarchy determined access to resources, where scarcity was managed through favor and position, this systematic approach to abundance represented something entirely new. It wasn't just that America had more, it distributed what it had according to different principles. In the Italian army, Sergeant Conti observed one evening, officers ate first, then NCOs, then enlisted men got what remained. Here, everyone gets the same rations, prepared the same way, served at the same time. This equality of treatment extended beyond food. Medical care, living conditions, even recreational opportunities followed similar patterns. When several prisoners developed dental problems, American dentists provided the same quality care they gave to guards, a shocking experience for men accustomed to a system where quality treatment depended on rank and connections. Marco found himself increasingly troubled by comparisons between what he witnessed in Camp Florence and what he had left behind in Italy. His mother's last letter before his capture had described food shortages in Naples, electrical outages, and transportation breakdowns. Yet here, in enemy hands, he experienced none of these hardships. The contrast felt like a betrayal, not by America, which was simply being itself, but by leaders who had sent Italy to war against a power whose capacity they clearly hadn't understood. These thoughts remained private, too dangerous to voice openly. But Marco noticed similar quietude among many prisoners, particularly those with technical backgrounds or education. They were engaged in the same reassessment, the same painful reconciliation between what they had been told and what they now witnessed daily. When a guard casually mentioned that his family farm in Nebraska had received a new refrigerated truck for milk transport before he enlisted, adding that every dairy in the county has one now, the information passed through the Italian barracks like a shockwave. This wasn't just military capability. It was civilian infrastructure so advanced that it made their homeland seem decades behind. That night, as electric fans circulated desert air through the barracks, Marco listened to the soft voices of men coming to terms with defeat. Not just military defeat on distant battlefields, but the defeat of an entire worldview. The refrigerated trucks that arrived each dawn weren't just delivering food. They were delivering a future that Italy had not been prepared to imagine, let alone compete with. What would this mean for their country when the war finally ended? The arrival of winter brought cooler temperatures to the Arizona desert, but little change to the camp routine. The refrigerated trucks continued their daily deliveries, though their cargo shifted seasonally. More root vegetables, different fruits, heartier meals prepared for the cooler days. The consistency of supply remained remarkable to the Italian prisoners, who had grown accustomed to seasonal scarcity back home. What changed more noticeably was the prisoners' relationship with their captivity. After months in Camp Florence, the initial shock had faded into a complex adaptation. They had developed routines, found small ways to maintain dignity, formed cautious relationships with guards who showed kindness or shared common interests. Some even admitted privately that they were healthier and better fed than they had been as free soldiers in the Italian army. This comfort brought its own kind of shame. Captain Ferrara, whose authority had gradually eroded, spoke less often of resistance or Italian superiority. Instead, he focused on maintaining discipline among his men, preserving what military structure remained within their confined world. But even he could not deny the evidence that surrounded them daily, the undeniable proof of America's industrial and organizational advantages. Marco had been promoted to supervisor of the kitchen work detail, responsible for managing inventory from those refrigerated deliveries that had first stunned him months earlier. Working closely with American quartermaster personnel, he had gained insights into the supply systems that kept the camp functioning, the ordering forms, delivery schedules, and storage protocols that ensured nothing was wasted or spoiled. "This is how they fight the war," Corporal Jenkins explained to him one morning, showing a standardized form used throughout the Army. "Same system everywhere, from here to England to the Pacific Islands. Makes everything interchangeable." The concept was revelatory. In the Italian military, supply had been chaotic, dependent on individual officers' connections and improvisational skills. American logistics, by contrast, functioned like machinery, predictable, reliable, and scalable. It wasn't glamorous or heroic, but its effectiveness was undeniable. The prisoners' conversations increasingly turned toward the future. With Allied forces advancing through Italy itself, many wondered what would await them upon eventual repatriation. Would they return to a homeland devastated by war? Would they find families who had suffered hardships they had been spared in captivity? Most troubling, how would they reconcile what they now knew about American capabilities with the society they would help rebuild? "We cannot simply copy them," argued Lieutenant Rizzo during an evening discussion. "Italy has different resources, different geography, but we must learn from what we've seen here." "What I will remember," said Sergeant Conti, "is not just the abundance, but the system behind it. Not just that they had refrigerated trucks, but that those trucks never failed to arrive." These reflections were interrupted by unexpected news. As Christmas approached, the camp commandant announced that families in nearby Phoenix had volunteered to host groups of Italian prisoners for holiday dinners. The Geneva Convention allowed such arrangements under guard supervision, and many local families had Italian heritage themselves. The invitation provoked intense debate among the prisoners.
Some, particularly officers like Captain Ferrara, viewed acceptance as a form of collaboration, even betrayal of Italy. Others saw it as a rare opportunity to glimpse American civilian life firsthand. After much discussion, about half the prisoners agreed to participate. Marco found himself assigned to the home of the Esposito family, third-generation Italian-Americans who owned a restaurant in Phoenix. The journey from camp was itself revealing. Paved highways stretching across desert, cars and trucks moving freely despite wartime. No signs of the fuel shortages that had paralyzed Italian transportation. The Esposito home, modest by local standards, featured electric appliances, indoor plumbing, and, most striking, a refrigerator in the kitchen, humming with the same mechanical song as the delivery trucks. "My grandfather came from Naples," explained Mrs. Esposito, as she served a feast that blended Italian traditions with American abundance.
"He arrived with nothing but became a business owner. Both my sons are in college now. One will be a doctor." The social mobility she described so casually represented another revelation. In 3 generations, this family had achieved what might take centuries in the rigid class structure of Italy. Their refrigerator, their automobile in the driveway, their sons at university, these weren't signs of aristocratic privilege, but the normal expectations of working people. When the prisoners returned to camp that evening, they brought more than leftovers carefully wrapped by their hosts. They carried new questions about what kind of society might emerge from the ruins of war, about what elements of American systems might be adapted to Italian realities, about their own roles in shaping that future. Marco lay awake that night, thinking of the Esposito's refrigerator, so similar to the cooling units on the trucks that had first captured his attention months ago. These weren't just machines, he realized, but symbols of a society organized around principles of efficiency, abundance, and distribution. The mechanical hum that had once seemed so alien now represented possibility, a different way of structuring not just logistics, but perhaps society itself. As the new year of 1944 began, the prisoners of Camp Florence continued their strange, suspended existence, physically confined yet mentally expanding. The refrigerated trucks still arrived each dawn, their engines announcing another day of systematic plenty in the desert. But now the men recognized them not as miracles or propaganda, but as manifestations of deliberate choices. Technical, organizational, and ultimately social choices that had created such capacity for production and distribution. Would Italy, when peace finally came, be capable of making similar choices? Could a society built on tradition, hierarchy, and historical greatness transform itself to embrace systems that delivered refrigerated abundance to ordinary citizens? Or would the lessons of captivity fade once they returned to familiar shores? Marco didn't know the answers, but as he watched another truck arrive through the morning mist, its engine humming that now familiar mechanical song, he understood that he and his fellow prisoners had received an education more valuable than any they could have imagined when they surrendered in the North African sand. They had glimpsed not just America's present, but a possible future, one where technological systems served human needs with mathematical precision, where abundance was managed through organization rather than privilege. The trucks would continue their deliveries until the war's end, maintaining their clockwork schedule regardless of the philosophical questions they inspired. And long after the prisoners returned home, long after Camp Florence fell silent, the memory of that mechanical hum would remain, a quiet, persistent reminder of possibilities glimpsed through the unlikely window of captivity, where enemies became reluctant teachers and refrigerated food became the first step toward imagining a different world.